Today's keynote speaker is Meg Caldwell. She's been the director of the Environmental Natural Resources Law Program at Stanford Law School since 1994. In the law school, she teaches land use, and coastal law and policy, and her scholarship focuses on the interface between law, science, and policy. Since the fall of 2007, she's been the director of Stanford's Center for Ocean Solutions, which is a collaboration between Stanford and MARI, and she'll tell you more about that during her talk. Meg's other shining accomplishments to choose from: she was on the Coastal Commission in California from 2004 to 2007, and for 2 of those years she was the chair of the Coastal Commission. She has also been a member of the NLPA Blue Ribbon Task Force since 2004, and that's what her talk is based on today. Students in the audience, if you are interested in talking more to Meg Caldwell and Steve Brody are both going to be here tonight, and we will be at the Wine Bar in town starting at 8 p.m., so feel free to come out and hang out with them. With that, I'm going to Meg.
Thank you. Oh, it's working. It feels really weird. So I just want to acknowledge how honored I am to be here, and I've already had so many conversations with different faculty members and students here, and it's clear you guys have a thriving ecosystem of multiple disciplines going on here, and I just am really glad that I have the opportunity to present this. And I also want to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper that is sort of the partial basis for my presentation. My experience with NLPA is, of course, the other major basis of my presentation, and those are Emily Sarman, who's a postdoc with Mark Carr, who's a marine ecologist at UC Santa Cruz, myself, and one of my own students, who is a JD student and also getting her master's in interdisciplinary program in environment and resources at Stanford, Medlin. I also just want to underscore what Maggie just said. I'm more than happy to speak with any of you, and definitely over wine is a great way to go. Somehow I managed to have a completely chock-a-block full schedule here, and so I apologize that it's gotten so full, but it's been a great experience rolling with it and occasionally getting to, well, actually I set up camp in like the best place out at the Everpass Center. So I sort of, in fact, I think I should just sleep there tonight. It's a fabulous location. So what I'm going to do today is actually briefly talk a little bit about the power of rules of thumb. I'm going to definitely give you some history on the Marine Life Protection Act and talk about the utility of using science. And when I refer to science, I refer to all forms of science, natural, physical, and social sciences, and that's really important to keep in mind. Since forever, it seems, I've been deeply immersed in multiple disciplines. Of course, my core discipline is the law and law and policy, but when you work in the environmental or resource field, you are necessarily interacting with folks from a whole wide range of areas of expertise and disciplines if you're doing your work right. And so way back from the early 80s, or mid-80s, when I was involved in Superfund site investigation and remediation, all the way to the work that I'm doing right now that's really focused on coastal and marine systems, my work has always been involved with scientists from all the disciplines. And so just want to get that out of the way right away and move on. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk a lot about NLPA because I know that there are some misconceptions about how NLPA has been implemented and many ideas about how it's being implemented, and then try to kind of wrap up with how we actually apply these scientific rules of thumb in our own decision making with NLPA and the kind of results that we're getting from that. So there are some famous rules of thumb out there, and Dick Barber actually brought up one that I'm not going to mention that has something to do with domestic violence, actually. But I will mention an economist named Pareto, and you guys can figure that one out. I'm going to talk to Dick about that one. Well, actually, Dick's not, but talk to Justice Ginsburg about that, is what I should say. There's a story on that. The 80-20 rule, sort of a very famous rule of thumb that now has been extrapolated into sort of every conceivable realm. The whole idea of Pareto, an economist from Italy, sort of looked around and 1906 and said, my God, there's a lot of wealth concentrated here. And he found that 20% of the individuals were controlling about 80% of the wealth in Italy. And then others started to look at this 20-80 ratio and started to realize, hey, it kind of applies to a lot of things. Now it's widely used with sort of excellence in management, training seminars and things where 20% of your work is really the vital stuff that you have to pay attention to, and the other 80% is really trivial. But it's that other 80% that consumes most of your time. You really need to be concentrating on the stuff that's really pivotal. So there are many different rules of thumb on the 80-20 slide. If you talk to a middle school teacher, they'll tell you that 20% of the students cause 80% of the problems in the classroom, things like that. They're all over the place. There's another rule of thumb that actually I wanted to grab the flyer and I forgot that is in your dining hall. And that's a rule of thumb about how to deal with a riptide. So what's the rule of thumb in how to deal with a riptide?
Swim parallel.
But it's mainly relax, actually. If you look at that flyer, it's relax, let it take you out, and then swim parallel, because eventually you'll come back around. So anyways, you have one hanging in your dining hall. And this rule of thumb I thought was really salient for those of us who ever had to do anything with hazardous materials, and those of you who work in wet labs should take this quite seriously. So, anyways, moving on. There is certainly in my own professional career, and it certainly didn't start there, there's been tremendous demand on the scientific community to assist us with our policymaking and decision-making around natural resources in particular. And there's, politicians and policymakers and the community at large tend to find the integration of science really compelling because they feel that there's this degree of objectivity that exists in science, that scientists sort of subject their own work to peer review, so it's sort of like solid, and you can really depend on it, it's completely credible in that regard, and that scientists know how to quantify uncertainty, and uncertainty is such a hard thing to deal with when you're making important policy decisions about very precious resources that many people want to get their hands on. So it's not surprising that in many different realms we find incorporated, actually codified in our laws that deal with resources of various types or public health, attention to that. And I just want to really briefly give you a few examples and then zoom right in on MLPA. MLPA, hold that for a second, we're going to go into that. The Magnuson-Stevens Act is certainly one where increasingly, as it's been amended over time, there's increasing attention to the reliance on science and the best available science. Internationally, we're seeing folks across the globe really incorporate laws like this European Food Authority law, which was passed in sort of the shadow of the mad cow disease problem in the European Union, that they needed to have scientifically rigorous review of all food items, from feed to fish. And so this act actually called for very rigorous scientific risk assessments for anything that's going to ultimately or has the potential to end up as food for human beings. So here's some text you can just refer to. Sound scientific guidelines, best readily available science. These are common phrases. Again, best scientific information available for MSA, and best available science for the EU. So, despite the fact that we are continually looking to scientists to help us figure out how to manage these resources better and to base it on really sound judgment that is verifiable and credible, there are a lot of challenges to integrating scientists into the decision-making process, and I'll just review a few of them that we point out in the article. First of all, decision makers, policymakers often have very low scientific literacy and often lack the kind of familiarity that each of you has. I mean, so many of you are deeply into your own field. We have some interdisciplinarians here too. And even in that, even if you're an interdisciplinarian, you still are looking to other experts in the field to really fill in the gaps for you and to understand. So if you were placed in the position of a policymaker about how to design a network of MPAs, you would probably be calling on your economist friends and your marine ecologist friends and your physical oceanographer friends to really understand the system. Well, decision makers often don't even know which experts to call on because they don't even know the right questions to ask because they haven't got the kind of scientific literacy that so many of you in the room have. And so this is a real challenge to build the literacy of the policymakers to the point where they can help ask the right questions that really matter to them so that they know what's important, what's relevant, what kind of science is really driving, or what's the underpinning knowledge that I need to know to understand things that what's driving the resources that I really care about, or the causal relationships that I really care about. And there's so much complexity, of course, in our understanding of the natural world, the economic world, the political world, how communities operate, and so many different levels of complexity, scales of complexity, and scientists just love that. I mean, academics love it. We study it all the time. We dissect it, talk about it, analyze it, write it. But we're not real good often about communicating it. And this graphic on the right is actually a graphic that the scientists used to try to explain what was going on with trade-off analysis with our different MPAs in the Central Coast, I think. Well, no one understood that. No one understood it. And they were trying to convey complexity, but it was in a manner that just wasn't getting through. So that gets to a later point too. And of course there's so much variability. How much is natural variability? How much are these longer term drivers and regime shifts? And how do we make sense of the two? So we hit these valleys and ridges in our graphs, and abundance, low abundance. What's going on? Is it better? Is it due to a management change, or is it just natural variability, or is the trend going in one direction? So the other problem is that the scientific community is not uniformly great at communicating things to the rest of us, and often get completely tied up and knickers in a twist about the different kinds of uncertainties, whether it's process measurement, model, or causal uncertainty that you're looking at, or all of them together and trying to explain, compounding uncertainties and joint probabilities, and it's really difficult for policymakers to understand that. And these two, this stuff happens all the time in my world. Looking at error bars and basically saying, so you really don't know. And that's the answer they get. So it really doesn't matter how far off we are, the size of spacing guidelines, because there's so much uncertainty here. And mistaking correlation for causation. So what we often end up with is too much information, not delivered in a way that is understandable, and we have decision makers who either just ignore the information altogether, or they get completely bogged down and have no idea what to do with it. So a couple examples of that. Here's an example from forestry management. This is a short list of what is, I think, more than 25 indicators that were listed in the forest management plan. And these were an attempt to assign indicators that would correlate with various objectives and goals in the forestry management plan. And the problem is that the forestry managers failed to prioritize their objectives. So what happened is the scientists went to work, they took all the objectives, and they created indicators to kind of help figure out how you would meet those objectives. But once they got all this information, the managers had no idea what to make of it because they hadn't figured out their priorities in the first instance, and there are way too many choices. So this is an example of too much information, failure to prioritize, and failure to understand which of these are really the high leverage items for the system to operate well based on the goals that you set out for yourself. So connecting those two. And then in EPA's sort of unbelievable attempt to regulate asbestos, it took over a decade for EPA, once it knew that asbestos, particularly friable asbestos, was causing very serious public health injuries and fatalities, asbestosis. It actually took them a decade to ban asbestos because they were absolutely paralyzed by the depth of information that was coming in. So we, in hindsight, looking back at how MLPA evolved and how we started to make sense of our objectives and figure out how the science could weigh in best, realized that basically our scientists, our scientific community was coming out with these rules of thumb. And so we started looking at that more carefully and thinking, this is a pretty cool approach. We kind of like how this seems to be playing out. And here's the essence of the sort of rule of thumb approach. First, you take these, often very complex scientific concepts and the empirical evidence and the analysis that's been produced through the peer-reviewed literature, and you convert it into more practical and concrete terms that are understandable by the lay audience, which is typically the policymakers, and certainly many of your stakeholders who may have a lot of practical knowledge, hands-on knowledge about what's going on with the resource, but may not be as familiar with the formal scientific analysis and literature that exists regarding the resource. And then, then there's that deep connection that you need to make with the decision makers, which is, what do they really need to know about? What do they care about? Well, that requires a really strong dialogue between the scientific community and the policymakers about what they're worried about, what they think they're worried about, what their goals are, so maybe you can help them connect what they should be worried about with what their goals are, and then the information that can help inform their decision at the end of the day. And then the emphasis on explaining the relevance of information cannot be underscored, because often what will happen, and this happens all the time in public hearings, say one group or another, the project proponent or an NGO or whatever, will they have the perfect scientist gets up there and explains all the data that's relevant to the policymaker and never explains why it's relevant. They just give him, and so there, of course you should do X. And so this link is absolutely critical, and I'm going to walk you through the process that we followed in NLPA to make it more live. So this is just a little cartoon that I drew up that I think helps to exemplify what this NRC report was about in 2006, which is this knowledge to action supply chain. And they're really focused on how you get the relevant science into decision makers' hands so that they can understand the empirical evidence and understand what's driving changes and how they can do course corrections and accomplish their goals better using information. And so, of course, my life starts at the top with law and goes all the way around to back to science, and it's a feedback loop. So if you're following resilience theory, you're type feedback loop and adaptive management. Here, I just want to show you the modules, the parts of this continuous loop, where I feel scientists have a particularly strong role to play. And it's not to say that scientists can't be civic citizens too, and be legislators and be policymakers in their own rights. Many scientists decide to do that at some point in their career. But for those scientists who are interested in the delivery of information that is relevant to the political process and to policymaking and resource management, these are the areas where I think scientists have a particularly strong role. And I'll try to refer back to this sort of loop system as I talk about NLPA. Any questions about that? So the NRC report talked about these 5 attributes of rules of thumb, or the translation of science for decision makers. And it talked about the importance of having, strong credibility, relevance. They actually listed first, but I reordered that so it would form the acronym CRUST, because I thought that, I don't know, I always use acronyms when I'm working through stuff, and it helps remember me to recall the key elements quickly. Most of these are really common sense, probably to you, and yet, the NRC thought that this was important new information to provide in their 2006 report because they weren't seeing it in action. So the case study, of course, is MLPA. So a little bit about the history of MLPA. Next slide. So problem identification. In the late 90s, California had 88 marine protected areas in state waters. There was no logic to this assemblage of MPAs. Many of the MPAs were really, really small. Some of them were set up just to protect a little intertidal zone, tide pools. Some of them were set up to protect species that had been there at one time when the MPA was initially set up, like the pismo clam, but over time had been extricated from the area. And some MPAs were set up, and we couldn't figure out what the original logic was at all. There was really no kind of legislative history for the MPA. So we had this disjointed array of MPAs. We also had a situation with state law where if you wanted to establish an MPA as a citizen, stakeholder, you actually had to make a really strong case before the Fish and Game Commission in California that an MPA was necessary. You had to make a case that it was absolutely necessary for the protection of a particular species, or that it was necessary to address an emergency situation of some kind. So the threshold was very high. The standard was super high to even get an MPA in place under our resources code. And we had a situation which was common across the nation, with many of our commercially important fisheries were in a very downward spiral, collapsing, and there was great concern about what we should do about that. And there was emerging science that talked about the importance of protecting sort of ecosystems as a whole. And the EBM stuff was really starting to percolate up, but so was the science around MPAs, and the evidence was coming in through the scientific literature where marine reserves in particular were being analyzed around the globe. And you're familiar with this document, I'm sure. The PISCO booklet that is now in its second edition, I believe, and translated into many different languages, which really synthesizes the analysis of these marine reserves in particular, although their most recent edition also gives a nod to MPAs that are not full no-take reserves, and pulls it all together in a way that is pretty understandable. It does a really good job of demonstrating the efficacy of these marine reserves for recovery of species in various ways, and recovery of habitat. So all of the science was gurgling up at the same time, and demonstrating the abundance and biomass and size and biodiversity that was being observed in these marine reserves. And a few folks got together in California and wrote up the Marine Life Protection Act based on this science. So it was really based on their observation of the scientific literature and concern about the decline of our marine ecosystems. I mean, they cited many different things in the preamble to the Act, and many different purposes were cited during the testimony for the Act, which was relatively non-controversial, by the way, in 1999, which is interesting. And these are these 6 explicit goals, actually, that they said the Marine Life Protection Act was designed to achieve. And if you look at these goals, they're really about ecosystem health and building long-term sustainability and resiliency, all these terms that we have trouble coming up with precise definitions for. But protecting natural diversity and functioning, sustaining and restoring populations. Yes, providing recreational value and supporting education and research, and protecting really unique habitats, and actually this sentence goes, or this little paragraph of which this is a part, goes on to talk about natural heritage sites in California, places like Point Sur and other big headlands that are Point Reyes, that are just, they're iconic locations. And the importance of having some coherency, providing some clear objectives behind the NPAs. What are they set up to do, and what will they achieve, or meant to achieve? And then have our NPAs work as a network together. So get rid of this disjointed group of NPAs and design a system that should be working together for long-term sustainability. You'll notice that there's really not a lot of talk about fisheries here. And in some of the continuation of some of these sentences into paragraphs, there is a discussion of restoration of depleted fisheries that are commercially important. But the focus is really on ecosystem function. So the mandate under the Act is to complete the network by 2011. And we had a couple failed attempts with the Marine Life Protection Act. I'm going to leave this slide up for a second so you can kind of absorb it. It looks like a spiral graph a little bit. But we had a couple failed attempts. Passed in 99, about 2000, the first attempt. And it's important to note that the Marine Life Protection Act requires that the Fish and Game Commission in California actually review the existing array of NPAs and develop a new set of NPAs that function as a network and honor the goals of the MLPA. Well, in California, the Fish and Game Commission does not have control over water quality. It does not have control over air quality. It does not have control over land use. It does not have control over markets. It does not have control over the myriad of other aspects of the system, the coupled human-natural system, that necessarily affect how our marine and coastal ecosystems are functioning. What it does have control over is fisheries, state fisheries. So, important to note, the goal is a very broad goal for ecosystem health. The tool that is given to the state to implement this law is really spatial management of fisheries. Okay, so that's the way it is. There was a lot of discussion about having it be quite different, but the Fish and Game Department itself and folks who were aligned with the Fish and Game Department and the Fish and Game Commission at the time wanted this control to be housed within the Fish and Game Commission. So while there was talk about having it housed within an overarching agency that actually had membership from all the different sectoral agencies, the decision was political, and it was decided to place this responsibility in the hands of the Fish and Game Commission. So here we are. This actually is a result of having seen two attempts to implement the Act. The first attempt had basically people saying, well, it's got a lousy process. It was a stakeholder, science, collaboration approach and process, but it had the scientists drawing the lines on the map first. And when the scientists came out of their own internal process and handed over the maps to the regional stakeholders, in that case, people went ballistic. And so it failed. It failed under its own weight for not having that important stakeholder participation from the very beginning. The second attempt, a couple years later, actually was a much better process, but ran out of money. So then in 2004, we have a brand new governor in the state of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who won by a recall election. And immediately out of the gate, he says that oceans are a priority. He tasks his administration with drafting a California Ocean Action Plan, one of the sort of key components of which is to breathe new life into the Marine Life Protection Act. So this becomes an immediate political priority from the highest office in our state. Unfortunately, we still don't have a lot of money to support a huge, robust process. What happens is a consortium of foundations step up and say, we will put a portion of the money to run this process if the state commits to seeing the process through and meeting a set of milestones and guidelines for accomplishment of this, and agrees to a process that we think is transparent and robust. So that was those were the stakes. Now, this is a governor who believes deeply in public-private partnerships. I know many people have different feelings about this. We certainly have a full range in California, but he believes that this is a very important way to go moving forward. He's embracing them for all sorts of different things. Major infrastructure projects in California included toll roads, you name it. So this is part of his philosophy as well. And so the foundations put up millions of dollars and signed basically a consolidator of that money, helped develop this very explicit Marine Life Protection Act initiative process, which is sort of described here, and I'll walk you through it. And the Resources Agency and the Fish and Game Department leads signed the MOU, and then the foundations walked away and said, great, we don't want to have anything to do with the substance of the decision making, but we want you to meet your deadlines. And then it was up to the state in this initiative process to execute on implementing the act. So what you've got here is, the act is the supreme being. I'm a lawyer, so I always make it a big thing, but you probably would draw it differently. Fish and Game Commission is the ultimate decision maker, and the structure here is that we had the MOU set up a system where we had our own independent staff. So, and this is really key, this is a group of planners, essentially, and public policy folks who know how to run public process and are familiar with resource planning, but they're not state employees, and they are not subject to the contracting red, blue, purple tape that is omnipresent in state systems. So essentially, this is a team of experts that can turn on a dime. They are not the primary, ultimate, initial decision makers by any sense. They're really the process tenders, and they're there to staff each of these other groups. So the Fish and Game Commission, ultimate decision maker. Department of Fish and Game, they of course support the Fish and Game Commission and have their own interest as well in terms of how whatever we do with our marine protected areas, how it jives with fisheries management in the state. Then here's the new stuff. So yes, the old processes had a regional stakeholder group. Our regional stakeholder group is very broad. Each of the regional stakeholder groups for each region of the state is selected by our initiative staff and is supposed to be broadly representative of a whole range of stakeholders. Typically within LPA, the sort of majority of stakeholders in our regional stakeholder groups have been from fisheries, various fisheries and industries, commercial, recreational, artisanal, you name it. Just about the majority, and then every other conceivable stakeholder that you can imagine. And a science advisory team that is appointed actually by the executive director of the Fish and Game Department. And then this thing in the middle, which is what I was a part of, which is this Blue Ribbon Task Force. And we were essentially supposed to provide recommendations to the Fish and Game Commission for the ultimate array of MPAs. And we were selected as people who had kind of been used to public process, were accustomed to very controversial situations, tough decision making, had some familiarity with the application of science to decision making, but basically were people that demonstrated somehow that we had adequate sort of good judgment potential. And we were appointed by the Secretary of Resources. A friend of mine says, oh yeah, you're like the Council of the Walleyes or something, but I think, now we're just, I don't know what we are. We're crash test dummies of sorts. anyhow, this is the basic structure. These lines here are meant to indicate that the Department of Fish and Game certainly could be considered a stakeholder, and many of our other agencies served on the stakeholder group as stakeholders. So California Coastal Commission served as state parks, national parks, BLM, you name it, many State Water Resources Control Board, Regional Water Resources Control Board, local sewage treatment plant people, you name it. We had a lot of different agencies serving as regional stakeholders as well. Some of whom decided that they would be voting members, some of whom decided that they wouldn't be. It was up to them whether or not they were going to weigh in that manner. And so Fish and Game worked very closely with the regional stakeholders, and the Science Advisory Team worked very closely with all of us, raising the scientific literacy of the regional stakeholders, the task force, and the Fish and Game Commission. Here's just a little laundry list of what I saw as our essential roles, since I'm focusing much more on, know my role best and really want to focus on the Science Advisory Team's role. It really is about building literacy, developing these operational guidelines or rules of thumb that we could use to draw lines on a map, actually assigning levels of protection for different forms of fishing so we can understand which fishing has a greater impact on the ecosystem function and processes than others, evaluating the marine protected area alternative proposals, both under the scientific guidelines for ecological functioning and processes and under the guidelines, under a set of approaches for trying to estimate what the maximum conceivable economic impact would be. And there's a long story behind that. That was the form of economic analysis that was decided on by the initiative team staff and by the scientists that they spoke with. I think that if you talk to the economists from EcoTrust who did the economic analysis, they would have liked to have done a multi-million-dollar, very sophisticated socioeconomic analysis. That wasn't fully available, nor is it called for under the Act. So the Act does actually talk about socioeconomics, and it talks about them in terms of considering socioeconomics and explicitly honoring socioeconomics by making sure that stakeholders are at the very basis foundation of the decision making. Other roles of the science team, just really figuring out ways to improve the stakeholder proposals so they better met the goals of the Act, and helping us discern between those questions that were essentially more scientific questions and those questions that were really explicit policy choices. And the scientists were pretty good about trying to stay as far away from the policy choices as possible. So we did divide the state up into 5 planning regions. They're shown here. We started with the Central Coast and then moved to North Central Coast. So I'm going to primarily be reflecting on those two. We're in the middle, or at the tail end actually, with the task force of the South Coast. And the week after next, we'll be moving into the North Coast as a task force. Again, the typology, the tools that we had available to us were different forms of marine protected areas that essentially reflect different forms of extraction. No take, no commercial take with marine parks, but some recreational take allowed, and then state marine conservation areas that allow some combination of commercial and recreational, and that was up to the individual regulations that were written for an MPA to figure out how you would divide that up. So moving into how we got into these rules of thumb, the scientists basically took those 6 goals that I set out earlier, and they said the one about being clear about objectives, we don't really have anything special to say about that. That really speaks for itself. We do have something to say about the other 5 goals. We believe that the scientific literature really informs you here, and we're going to help you synthesize that literature and convert it into basic guidelines or rules of thumb that then stakeholders can use to draw lines on a map. So they often grouped the goals and said, well, we see here about protection of natural diversity and functioning and protecting habitats. Really, the proxy here is protect key habitats. So what we're going to do is we're going to help you figure out what the key habitats are in your area and ensure that they're mapped So we use this great decision support tool early on called Doris, now called Marine Map. You can go fool around with it yourself, just Google it, you'll get right into it. You can start creating an array of marine protected areas yourself. And Marine Map will actually run the evaluation for you too and tell you how well you're doing against the guidelines. So we ended up with 18 key habitats. And for each of these habitats, the scientists were very good, and all of the slides that I'm showing you are taken from Science Advisory Team presentations. So you're seeing actually what we received as recommenders to the ultimate policymakers. And they talk about like rocky intertidal. Well, we have a lot of monitoring data from PSCO, the consortium of academic institutions along the West Coast that are doing monitoring of nearshore. And basically, we learned from that monitoring that if you take about 60%, 0.6 linear mile, you can roughly cover about 90% of the biodiversity that is has fidelity to that habitat. So this is the way that they started to break things down for us, and so on. So looking at the data and then telling us, well, if you want to protect about 90% of the biodiversity that's associated with that habitat, this is about how much area you need to cover, the distance that you need to cover. They also looked at, the complexity of our systems. This is a map taken from the South Coast where we have a very complex system. You've got the Davidson Current coming up, the California Current coming down, meeting at Point Conception, but then you've got all sorts of crazy biogeography and currents and connectivity happening in the South Coast that roughly helps you divide up the South Coast region into these sub-bioregions. And so for each bioregion then, we were looking at the replication of key habitats because these bioregions kind of function as individual modules. They are connected, of course, to the broader ecosystem, but they really do reflect larval transport and species movement on a sort of sub-regional level. Second goal, conserving marine life populations, including ones that are commercially valuable. And for that, the scientists said, well, basically, the MPAs have to be large enough to ensure that a fairly sizable portion of the individuals you're hoping to protect with these MPAs, these ones of including those of economic value, can actually will be protected with by an MPA of a certain size. So that's a long way of saying that was sort of not clear at all. But they said really that means looking at adult movement and adult neighborhoods and understanding among those species that you've identified, California, that you're interested in protecting, there are choices that you have to make here because the scientific evidence shows that these different species have different degrees of adult movement or adult neighborhoods. So here we are, presented with a choice. What the scientists were able to do is help make explicit what the choices were for us. So we had this broad range of species that we were interested in. They said, well, if your MPAs are roughly a 10-kilometer size, you're going to be roughly protecting these species. If you go a bit bigger, you can start to protect these other commercially valuable rockfish, for example, and start to protect some of the mammals. But you're not going to be able to protect everybody unless you go quite a bit larger. And we had people like Ray Hilborn on our science advisory team, and Carl Walters, who said essentially MPA should be huge. If you really want to protect the whole ecosystem and all the trophic interactions, you got to go huge. That was not, politically possible in California. So the choice of sort of which species to protect and how big we would go actually came out of a recommendation from the science advisory team if you want to protect some of those commercially valuable species, and went all the way up through the task force up to the Fish and Game Commission for a political review and approval. So this is a choice that is informed informed by science, but ultimately made by the political body involved. So we have a science guideline or rule of thumb that a long-term minimum span should be 5 to 10 kilometers, preferably 10 to 20. And because species and their life histories are such that they often inhabit different depth zones across their life history, it's important to cover the depth zone out to the full extent of state waters if possible. So they helped us evaluate the different proposals as a result. And this is an example of a slide, which if you look at it initially, it looks like nothing. But they really walked us through it. And they said, this really shows you the marine protected areas from the different proposals. And the proposals are here, indicated along the left. How well they're doing. In proposal 0, which is no action, don't change anything, you can see almost all the MPAs in this region are below the minimum size. In proposal 1, which was viewed as a conservation proposal, you can see that you've got MPAs of all sizes, but you have at least 3 that are in the preferred range. Proposal 2, pretty similar to proposal 1. Proposal 3 doesn't do quite as well in terms of these large MPAs, but it's still doing pretty well relative to 1 and 2. So this was a way that we could start to understand how the proposals were stacking up against each other. 6th goal, designing as a network. So for this, the SAT said you really have to look at connectivity. And for connectivity, you're essentially looking at larval recruitment. And how do you protect, because you know, once an adult moves out of their MPA, they're available for take based on the regulations that exist there. Larvae, on the other hand, you know, what you really want to do is make sure that if they are highly mobile, that they're able to land in a place where then they can grow up to be big, fat, old females if they're rockfishes and be ultra prolific and produce those really strong young. So they explained this to us and talked about how close the MPAs need to be to one another in order to protect different species based on how their larvae move. And this is the rule of thumb that actually emerged from that, or this is the information that they provided to us about larval dispersal. They showed us these graphs. They said different species, basically, you know, their larvae, the science shows that they disperse at different distances. And if you want to catch the species that were in your other ground that you thought you were worried about, those rockfish species, for example, that were commercially valuable, then you probably should look at spacing no greater than 50 kilometers or so. So the rule of thumb that came out was that MPAs should not be separated by anything greater than 50 to 100 kilometers. And if you have a hope of really protecting the larvae as they're moving from one MPA to another. Now, and you might ask, well, come on, you got to pay attention to the biogeography. Well, we did. So we had long lectures and modules on the biogeography and where there were retention centers, where there were upwelling centers, where we saw sort of spawning aggregations, things of that nature, to understand how you could start to piece all this stuff together so that the spacing actually made sense. And then they gave us evaluations. They looked at different proposals and they said, well, this right here is your sweet spot. And the proposal that comes closest to having spacing that is close enough for their MPAs for the different key habitats is really proposal 1, but proposal 3 actually is even better. And proposal 2, you know what, you need to improve a little bit. So for these key habitats, see if you can do a better job of reducing your spacing between your MPAs. So that's the nature of the guidance that would come back from the evaluations. And here's just additional network rules of thumb. A lot of talk about the importance of replication. not only for research and study, but also for sort of long-term resiliency and thinking about instances where if a key habitat or MPA gets wiped out by an oil spill or some other insult, there'll be other areas where that key habitat is protected. And this is another graphic just showing another form of evaluation for us where key habitats are listed across the top. The incidence of these key habitats in the bioregion are indicated by the number parenthetically, and then how well each proposal captures that key habitat against that potential, which is up here, is indicated across these lines. So you see proposal 0 not doing very well. The best proposal in this case of capturing habitat where it is available is proposal 2. So just summing up the rules of thumb, we had a size, we had a spacing, we had a habitat coverage, and we had a replication rule of thumb for the stakeholders to use to draw lines on the map. And this, of course, we felt was incredibly valuable because we felt that it was credible information, we could rely on it, it was relevant to the goals of the Act, and it gave us something that we could convert into action. Otherwise, it's incredibly difficult to just take those broad goals and start drawing lines on a map without having them anchored in fact, in any kind of empirical evidence. This just shows this, again, the scientists were sort of beat us over the head with constantly linking their guidelines or rules of thumbs to the language of the Act so we could understand where they came from and be able to sort of talk with one another about the value and importance of meeting a particular goal. And in some cases, knowing what we were giving up by violating a guideline. So we ended up in the South Central Coast going from just less than 4% coverage in marine protected areas and only 5 marine reserves that were really deep, to 29 MPAs covering 18% of the region with a little less than 8% in no-take reserves. For the North Central Coast, we went from 13 MPAs covering just less than 4% to a much larger number of MPAs. Okay, I didn't do the math on that right away, but covering 20% of the region with almost 12% in state marine reserve. Far cry from what Australia has done with 33%, but really significant for California. And that's it. I'm happy to answer questions.